Hello and welcome back. In this video we're going to look at the 5 things that we can do in processing our images. And my thanks go to Dr. Les Walkling for providing the background information for this video, and I'll put a link to Les's website in the notes and on the screen above. So go and check out his website because it's full of fantastic and useful information. So let's get started by looking at the first one. The first question we need to ask of our image is, does it need to be lighter or darker? Setting the overall tonality of the image determines the mood. And secondly, our eyes are drawn to the brightest parts of an image. So if we want to draw our viewer's attention to the important part of the image, we should make it lighter, and other parts of the image that are less important should be darker. So let's have a look at a couple of examples. In this image of the Tarkine wilderness, the original image was quite dark, and it was taken on a foggy morning, so I wanted to emphasize the effect of the fog. So lightening the image gave it a much more happier, lighter feeling and emphasized the effect of the fog. But in other images I've used a different effect. This image of the dragon taken in Ljubljana in Slovenia, I thought that it looked like it was threatening the town, and I needed a darker, more somber mood, and by using some processing I've turned daylight into nighttime and emphasized the threat from the dragon. And looking at another example, this troll statue from northern Iceland, very imposing and very threatening, and again I thought it needed a strong mood to make it look really threatening and dark. And so we have something like this, possibly a bit over the top, but emphasizing the threatening nature of the troll. And still in Iceland, looking at this image of the window in the old farmhouse, I was thinking about the fact that in the old days people lived indoors all through winter with only a tiny window looking out to the outside, and so it must have been cold, dark and damp for most of the time. So in this image I felt that we were really looking at someone looking out of the farmhouse window hoping for the first signs of spring, which are the little yellow daisies in the foreground. Again, still sticking in the northern hemisphere, this photograph of the walrus taken in Svalbard. I felt that the walrus is a really iconic creature of the north, and it really needed a lot of emphasis, so I really made the image dark and really brought out the character of the walrus. And finally, typical foggy morning photograph, again needed to be lighter to emphasize the lightness and the softness of the fog, and lightening up the image overall has given us a much better image. So determining lighter or darker is the first thing that we should look at in processing our images. Having set the tonality of our image, the next question we should ask of our image is, does it need to be warmer or cooler? And knowing that warmer colours tend to push forward in an image and cooler colours tend to push backwards, we can use this treatment to emphasize the third dimension in an image. But just looking at an overall effect, working in Lightroom, we can just simply modify the color temperature of an image by pushing the color temperature slider one way or the other. So our image here is of the interior of one of those ancient farmhouses in Iceland, and you can see the cramped and rather narrow conditions. But if we warm the image up, we get a much more cozy feel about the place. It doesn't feel threatening, it feels warm and cozy, whereas if we cool the image down a little bit, it can start to feel cold and uninviting. So setting the overall color temperature in the image can help to emphasize the feeling and the emotion in the image. So it's not just for interiors, but looking at a landscape. For instance, this image here taken at the Hell's Gate of Macquarie Harbour in Tasmania on the west coast it's an area of extreme weather conditions, and yet in this photograph it's been rendered with quite a painterly effect. But let's see what happens if we warm the color temperature up. It has a nice sunny summer's day feel about it, and whereas if we start to cool things down a little bit, it feels a little more threatening. And so just by simply manipulating the color temperature in an image, we can dramatically affect the mood, and you can determine how your viewer will interpret your image by simply setting the mood. Let's look at another example where we've done things a little bit differently. This set of rapids in Iceland, I've used a few tricks to really try to add back in the third dimension. In the foreground, as you can see here, we've introduced a lot more of the warmer colors to try and bring this foreground forward, and then you'll see in the background the colors are cooler and the resolution is softer, so we're pushing the background backwards, so we can really start to emphasize the mood. And even by just then warming the image up a little more, it takes away some of the threatening feeling of the image, or by cooling it down, it makes it feel much more cold and uninviting. So color temperature on its own can make a dramatic effect to an image. And let's have a look at one more example, and that is of this scene in the town of Vik in southern Iceland. Again, photographed on a fairly dark and miserable day. If we warmed the color temperature up, it would feel a lot less threatening, and if we cooled it down, you would get much more feeling of the threatening storms coming in. So using the warmer or cooler aspects of the image applied to either the whole image or just a part of the image can dramatically affect the emotional content. Looking at any image, our eyes are drawn to the brightest, the most contrasty and the most colourful parts, and by amending the colour or the saturation of parts of the image, we can draw our viewer's eye. In this photograph of an old town in Iceland, I've done quite a number of things, but apart from which I've increased the saturation of the reds and the blues, and you can see quite clearly in this image that the warmer tones of the building on the right hand side tend to pull forward, and the cooler tones, the building on the left and the old church in the distance, tend to pull backwards. So by manipulating the saturation of parts of the image, we can draw our viewer's eye to where we want it to visit. Likewise, in this image of the old town of Vik that we looked at earlier, I've darkened the town itself and reduced the saturation a little bit to emphasize the church in the foreground. And again, looking at the troll image that I looked at earlier, I have emphasized the yellows and oranges in the image to try and pull the troll figure forward while keeping the background dark and desaturated so that it will pull backwards. And also in the image of the old farm building, I have desaturated the colors quite strongly here and just left the yellow flowers in the foreground as our focus of attention so that we can really emphasize the story and making it look as though we're still in the bleak conditions of winter. And finally, looking at this walrus image, apart from doing a lot of lightening and darkening, I've also increased the saturation of the walrus itself, particularly the yellows and reds, to try and bring him forward, and then darkened down and desaturated the background to push it backwards to help generate that third dimension in the image. So using saturation selectively on parts or the whole image can dramatically affect where your viewer's attention will be drawn. When we talk about making images harder or softer, what we're talking about is increasing or decreasing the contrast. The way our eyes perceive the world is that things that are closer to us appear sharper, brighter, clearer. Things more in the distance have lower contrast, softer colors, lighter tones. So in this image that we're looking at now, the foreground has been made more contrasty as well as lighter and darker and more or less saturated, but we've also used some increased contrast to help emphasize the foreground, and then in the background we see we have lower contrast and that appears to recede away. So using more or less contrast can emphasize the parts of your image that you want your viewer to look at, or allow other parts to recede into the distance. The same with this image taken in Iceland of Kirkafell. The original image was a little bit flat, so by manipulating the brightness, the contrast, the saturation, and of course the warmer or cooler aspects, we've built up the image to make it stronger in the foreground. As you can see, there's a lot more contrast around the rocks and this grassy area in the foreground, and the mountain in the distance is a little less contrasty and fades away into the distance. As we can also see in this other image we looked at earlier, the foreground is a little more contrasty, a little warmer, a little stronger, and the background is softer and less contrasty. And looking at this image from an old town in Iceland, again, more contrast on the edges of the buildings gives the impression that they're much closer. The original image was fine, but adding those extra elements of brightness, contrast, saturation, and white balance helps to draw those elements forward. And lastly, looking at this image of the chimpanzee, by adding a lot of contrast and manipulating the background, we can help to draw him forward and separate him from the background. So the background's been darkened, the color has been reduced, and then more contrast has been applied to the character in front to help us draw our attention to what he's doing. The last of our 5 things that we can do to our images is make them sharper or less sharp or duller. So again, like contrast, things that are sharper or more clearly defined appear closer to the viewer and draw our attention. Things that are not as sharp or vague tend to recede into the distance. Looking at this image of Kirkafell again, you'll see that in the far distance the mountains are very soft and ill-defined. They're obviously in the distance, whereas if we come forward and look at the rocks in the foreground, we can see that these are very sharp, very clearly defined, have high contrast, more saturation, and all of those elements working together have helped to produce an image that has great depth to it. The same with this image of the ferns in Tasmania. By applying sharpening to things that are closer to the viewer, we get the feeling that things are closer to the viewer and more important to be looked at, whereas things in the distance, such as the trees in the far distance, they're softer and less defined. And looking at another option, part of this bear photographed in Svalbard, he was quite clearly defined against the background, but by adding sharpness and contrast, we've helped to bring him out even more and create that illusion of the third dimension. Same on these images, things that are closer to the viewer look sharper, things that are further away should be softer. The same with our chimpanzee, apart from added contrast, some added sharpening on the important parts, the face and the hands gives the impression of that gesture. These combine with all of the other tools to create an image that draws our viewer to the important parts. So to put all this together, looking at our image and asking ourselves the 5 questions: does my image need to be lighter or darker, warmer or cooler, harder or softer, more or less colourful, or sharper and duller? And applying those answers to the whole of the image or part of the image, we can help to create an image that has much more engagement for our viewer and that also helps to create that impression of the missing third dimension. In future videos, I'll be demonstrating techniques to work with these 5 aspects of modifying our images. So come back and look out for future videos, and I look forward to seeing you again soon.